Whether you call it Kveik, Kvik, or Kvike, there's no denying that this unique Norwegian yeast has had a remarkable impact on the brewing scene, and Imperial Yeast's A43 Loki is one of the best versions out there. With the ability to produce a clean beer when fermented as warm as 104 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius, you heard that right, while also performing well at more standard ale temperatures, Imperial Yeast A43 Loki is as versatile as it gets, meaning you have zero excuses for failing to brew throughout the year. Learn more about A43 Loki at imperialyeast.com and grab a pouch for your next batch to see what all the fuss is about. Of all of the advice experienced brewers are wont to offer new brewers, one of the most common is in regards to yeast health, which makes sense since yeast is the living organism responsible for turning the wort that we create into the beer that we end up drinking. Of course, the term yeast health refers to a few different things. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to discuss freshness as it relates to pitching yeast directly from the package, sans starter, of course, is contributor Cade Jobe.
Yeah, I'm excited. I mean, anytime we do an experiment that's related to yeast, I'm always blown away by the results, right? And I mean, yeast freshness is the thing that, like, when you hear older brewers or people who've been brewing for 30 years or whatever, you always hear them say, what's the most important thing? And they always say, make sure you pitch the proper amount of fresh, healthy yeast, right? Like, that's like the thing is like, this is what you have to do. Like, it's the be all and end all. You won't make great beer unless you do this. But I don't know if that's always the case, right? I mean, we're lucky. I mean, you've brewed a lot of batches, Marshall. I brewed a lot of batches, and I've cut some corners, and oftentimes that works. And so this is one of those that I was really curious about, and I was glad that we did an experiment on. If you're, checking whether you can pitch old yeast or fresh yeast, it's kind of fun.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I've been involved in brewing for over 2 decades at this point, and I have a very clear memory of when I first learned about the importance of yeast viability, which back then was pretty much universally improved through propagation in a yeast starter. Well, quite a bit has changed since then in terms of both yeast quality coming straight from the various labs that are out there, as well as in the way I view yeast health. I look forward to chatting with you about it today, Cade, as well as going over that experiment on the topic. Alrighty, if you enjoy this show and you'd like to help us keep producing it, please consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Coming up later this month, December of 2024, Brewlosophy's Alex Shanks-Abel will be hanging out with patrons and answering questions in addition to their role as a contributor to Brewlosophy, where they brew and write about experiments, the Hop Chronicles, Short and Shoddy, and all the other stuff we do. Alex has played an integral role in the Brew Lab, where they serve on the leadership team. Alex has also been a guest on the Brewlosophy show, where they've talked about things such as brewing like a cheapskate. If you haven't seen that episode yet, you've got to go watch it. This is going to be a very fun session. To be part of it, be sure to make your pledge of just $3 or more by Saturday, December 28th, as Alex will be taking questions this upcoming Sunday, the 29th. All past sessions are stored on our private Patreon and Facebook pages, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. Learn more about all of the rewards we offer for your support and become a patron today over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we'd appreciate that immensely, as it helps those who haven't heard of us yet to more easily find the show. Plus, we really do like knowing what you think. Just a quick side note, we were really pushing, getting over that 1,000 review mark in Apple Podcasts. And ever since then, I think we've got 200 more or so, but that was a year ago. It's like we met that goal and people are like, all right, cool, we can give it up. No, we want more of those reviews. So if you could do us the favor of going and leaving a review with a nice little note in Apple Podcasts or anywhere you listen to podcasts, we really would appreciate that. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who offer brewers various options for high quality, reasonably priced electric brewing rigs in various voltages and sizes. I've used their 120 volt system for 5-gallon batches as well as their 240 volt 10-gallon setup, and I'm telling you, these things are awesome. Clawhammer Supply really puts the effort into ensuring their systems do exactly as they're intended to do and as efficient a way as possible. If you're not ready to make the jump to electric just yet, they also sell 10 and 20-gallon brew-in-a-bag homebrewing starter kits. If you've been considering going electric, do yourself a favor. Visit clawhammersupply.com. We are confident you're going to love their stuff just as much as we do. All right, this episode's feedback comes from thousands of folks who all share the same sentiment, myself included. The Brew Lab is ending. What the hell, Cade? Did I mishear that? Is Cade really bringing one of the best science-oriented brewing podcasts to an end? Are you getting out of brewing? Did he get sick? What are we going to fill this vacuum with? These are all questions that I've received over the last month or so after you announced on the Brew Lab that you would be wrapping things up at the end of this year. And so I just thought I'd offer you, because I had the same feedback, Cade. You know this.
Yep.
I'd offer you the opportunity to kind of explain what's going on with the Brew Lab.
Yeah. It just came, it's time, right? In my personal life, for most people know, I've started my PhD studies at Oregon State University, and, PhD is quite a significant uptick in responsibility and research and all that stuff from the master's. And I also have 2 young kids. And so, the long and the short of it is the time, that I have available for my family and my own, work, is not enough. And the Brew Lab was one of the things that unfortunately took up a lot of the time and had to go, unfortunately. But I am going to be still brewing. I plan to still be, tangentially at least involved in Brewlosophy as long as Marshall doesn't kick me out.
Stop it.
I'm certainly going to be around and brewing and still available to answer any questions. And this will be cool. I'll finally have a, hopefully at the end of this, as long as I'm successful, I'll have a PhD in brewing science. So I'm pretty excited about that. And all of this started because of Brewlosophy. So I've always told everybody, and I love saying this, Brewlosophy is my heart. It's what got me interested in brewing science. Marshall, I was thinking about this the other day. If you hadn't started Brewlosophy in, 2013 or whenever it was that you started it and started publishing experiments on the website, I don't know that I would be doing what I'm doing right now.
Wow.
So you've totally
crazy.
changed my life. And the Brew Lab was a super fun part of that, man. I'm really proud of the work that we did there. And it was a lot of work. I know, Marshall, for you too. I mean, editing all the episodes and, taking care of making sure we have the best audio quality that we could. I mean, it's a lot of work to produce a podcast as everybody knows. But unfortunately, the Brew Lab is going to be coming to an end at the end of this year. I'm excited for the future though, and I'll still be around. If you have any questions or want to know anything, just shoot me an email.
Yeah, a couple of things real quick. And we're so proud of you, Cade. You know that. And what you created is amazing. But I think what you wrapping things up and speaking about it as candidly as you have been and us being honest about it, it gives me the opportunity to talk about some of the inner workings that I wouldn't usually talk about for the Brewlosophy podcast, because it feels kind of back patty in a way, but doing this thing is a bear. I mean, I think there's this assumption that if you're recording a podcast, that you're just sitting down for an hour with a friend of yours and hanging out, and then you wrap it up and you're done. That is not what goes on. You had an interview based podcast, so you were organizing interviews, trying to find people to come on and talk, which I don't think you struggled with too much, but I know there were times you'd text me and you're like, we had to cancel this interview because something came up. What do we do here? There's all of that going into it. And in order to make that viable, you have to be incentivized. Go listen to the Freakonomics or read the Freakonomics book. There has to be some incentive. The truth of the matter is, yes, there is some revenue that gets generated in doing this thing. It's not that much. We're still working our regular jobs. And that is why I think people probably get so sick of hearing us talk about helping support us. Patreon. We love doing this. I know you loved doing the Brew Lab.
yeah.
Now, you've also, in addition, you've got family issues and you've got school that you've got to focus on. So but man, there's a reason we do that, is because we want to continue doing this so that you all have this resource. Now, I was just sifting through old emails and stumbled upon one from May of 2020. We were right in the thick of COVID. And that was when you proposed, and I quote, and I'm dead serious, I just copy and pasted this from the email. I've got an idea for a podcast that might be a cool spinoff. You suggested names like Firm Education or Firm Ed.
Yeah.
I'd been camping on my annual Memorial Day off the grid, trip that week when you sent it. And so I wasn't able to respond for about a week. And I think you assumed that I just kind of deleted the email.
Or just like, yeah, no, that's not going to happen. That sounds dumb, Cade.
Yeah.
We're not going to do that.
But when I got back from the river, I got down the hill. I let you know that I actually loved the idea. And that was ultimately the spark. I'd always loosely referred to my garage as the Brew Lab, just kind of jokingly when I'd invite people over for data collection. But since your focus was going to be on kind of the deeper scientific stuff, it only made sense that we would adopt that moniker as the name of the new show. Well, here we are, 4.5 years and over 180 episodes later. You've interviewed some of the smartest people in beer, all in the name of helping people to brew better. Again, I'm just so proud of what you created. And while you may not be producing new episodes, I do want to let everyone know that all of those past episodes will remain available forever, or at least as long as I'm able to keep paying those server fees, which is not a big deal. They're going to be around for as long as Brewlosophy is around, which is going to be for a long time. So, Cade, thank you for that. We're going to be talking about the Brew Lab coming to an end in a future episode of the Brewlosophy podcast as well, sharing a little bit more details. But we appreciate everything you've done for Brewlosophy, and we're glad that you're going to be sticking around, contributing to this show, and potentially, once you're past some of the harder parts of getting your PhD, which, by the way, can relate. It's not fun doing it, but that you'll be contributing to the website and helping out in other ways as well. So, alrighty, if you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. When we're back from this break, our focus will be on yeast freshness when pitching direct from the package.
This holiday season, surprise everyone on your list with the best gifts. Tickets to see their favorite artists live. Choose from thousands of concerts and comedy shows, including Mariah Carey, Mary J. Blige, Matt Matthews, Metallica, Thomas Rhett, Trans-Siberian Orchestra, Sarah Silverman, and so many more. Share a memory together, or give a gift they'll never forget. Find the most exciting gift for every fan at livenation.com/gifts. That's livenation.com/gifts.
Chilling work can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Xchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brewlosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Xchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Xchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to xchillerator.com today.
Got great ideas, but no idea how to build a website? Get Bluehost. Their AI design tool creates high-quality WordPress sites super fast. Whether you're a blogger, influencer, or launching a side hustle, Bluehost helps boost your growth with built-in marketing and e-commerce tools. Upgrade to cloud and get 100% uptime and 24/7 security to stay online all the time. Why wait? You've got the vision. Make it real. Visit Bluehost.com to get started.
There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. The first 15 or so batches I brewed were from pre-made extract with steeping grain kits that I bought from my local homebrew shop up in Bellingham, Washington. These kits came with everything I needed to make a batch of beer, with instructions that directed me to simply pour the yeast from the package directly into the chilled wort. The beers I made were good enough to keep me brewing, but as I'm sure many can relate, it was not quite the quality I was after. I wanted my beer to taste as good or better than what I was getting at the store. So I transitioned to all grain, thinking the move away from extract would help. It was also around this time that I started engaging a bit more in online homebrewing forums and listening to brewing podcasts and such. Without question, my all grain batches were notably better than the stuff I was making before with extract, but still not quite hitting the mark. With just a couple all grain batches under my belt, I decided to yield to the common recommendation to build yeast starters, and bam, that was it, at least for the following few years. The truth is, as new labs began to pop up, like Imperial Yeast, who market higher pitch rates, I gradually drifted away from making starters and went back to pitching direct from the package. And as such, I was paying a little bit more attention to the freshness of the yeast I was using. Now, before we delve into the nitty gritty, let's spend some time going over some basics of yeast and fermentation. And who better to do that with than someone who is studying brewing science?
Yeah, studying brewing science, not a microbiologist though. So caveat there. Chemist more than microbiologist. But it's interesting too. So we mentioned the Brew Lab in feedback. One of the brewing topic that we covered probably the most in the Brew Lab was yeast, right? And it's interesting because when I started brewing, the packet of yeast that came with the Mr. Beer kit was just like this indescript like dry. It was a packet of dry yeast, and it had some numbers printed on it, but it wasn't like a label or date. It was more like somebody just put some yeast in a package and stamped it. It didn't say anything about the type of yeast or where it came from or how long it had been in the package or when it was put in there or any of that stuff. And it's just like, yeah, dump this yeast in and you'll make beer, which is the amazing thing about yeast. You can absolutely do that, right? You just dump in some random yeast and make beer and it works. But again, you hear like older brewers and people that have been in the brewing industry for a long time, and they just beat you over the head with, if your fermentation isn't good, your beer's not going to be as good, and that for me, like as an intro brewer was kind of like, okay, yeah, I don't really understand fermentation. I know that if I make sugar water and then put yeast in there, it makes beer, and that's good enough for right now, right? I want to play with hops, and I want to play with different malts, and I want to make a porter, and I want to make a lager, and I want to make all these other things. And yeast kind of like went to the back burner. But once I, like you, Marshall, started focusing on yeast, that's when my beers got better. And why is that? I mean, it's like we said, Marshall, at the top of this segment, that yeast is doing the hard work for us, right? Yep. I mean, we're out there for 6 or 7 hours on brew day, but yeast is the one that's taking all of those sugars and then making the alcohol and flavor products that we like in beer. I mean, it's doing all of that. It's a single celled organism. It's technically a fungus, right? Saccharomyces, which is sugar yeast, right? If it translates to that. So it's a yeast that consumes sugar, but it's really doing a whole lot. And we think of it oftentimes too in simple terms, right? Yeast takes sugar and then makes alcohol and carbon dioxide. Those are the things that we like in beer, alcohol and carbon dioxide. But it's doing so much more than that. There's fermentation byproducts, there's acetaldehyde, there's diacetyl, fusel alcohols, things that we want, esters, higher alcohols, liberation of thiols, from beta lyase activity, all these things that we love about beer and that make beers taste different, right? If you changed Pilsner malt versus pale malt, you might not actually see a difference. But if you brewed with Chico Flagship and Juice, those beers are going to taste different, right? And they're both ale yeast. They're both Saccharomyces cerevisiae, but wow, they're going to produce things different because the things that they do internally results in different outcomes. And so, monitoring them and helping them do the things that they want to do will increase those outcomes. If you want a juicy, fruity IPA, using juice, a little bit higher fermentation temperature might help. Or you might change the pitch rates or things like that, which is, so there's all these little tools and levers that you can play to have a great fermentation, but it really does come back to having a great fermentation.
Right. And I think the key there is that having a great fermentation, I don't want to make it sound like I disagree with this, because I don't, but as the experts will claim, is a function of having healthy yeast to do that fermentation. You mentioned a few byproducts, some being good. Like you said, there are certain styles where you want esters, you might want some, a phenolic characteristic in there, but other ones are pretty universally not wanted, like diacetyl. I mean, some people will say, oh, it's appropriate in small amounts in certain styles. I just don't want any diacetyl butter flavor in my beer at all, ever. I don't like the way it feels in my mouth. Acetaldehyde's another one. That's actually what a lot of people, that and fusel alcohols, a lot of people, the science seems to support that it's responsible for the painful hangovers, right? Mm-hmm. We don't want that stuff in our beer. But again, in the same way that yeast is responsible for producing alcohol and carbon dioxide, it is also responsible for producing acetaldehyde and fusel alcohols. And those tend to be, my understanding of this, Cade, again, not a microbiologist, but those tend to be due to yeast stress or less healthy yeast being pitched. So when we refer to we're using this term yeast health, let's kind of operationally define it real quick. In my mind, there's two main components to yeast health, and all of the other stuff that we talk about when it comes to yeast health falls under one of these two categories. I'll be curious to hear if you agree or disagree with me on that. But the first one is vitality. We've talked quite a bit about vitality. It's something that I learned of from Colin Kaminsky, who co-authored the Water Book with John Palmer. He reached out to me, a decade ago now, I think, proposing this idea for an experiment to test yeast vitality over viability. All vitality is how metabolically active the yeast is at the time that you pitch it. So it's basically a measure of how ready the yeast is to get into that wort and do its work, fermenting. So that's vitality. It's kind of like, the way I look at that is like, if you're prepping for a marathon, and you get stretched up and you maybe take one of those caffeine gels and you're ready to rip roar and get to running, that's vitality. Viability, on the other hand, is a measure of the number of living cells in a certain population of yeast, which can be objectively measured using specific tools like a microscope, though it's often predicted as a function of time or, yeast age. So vitality, viability to me are kind of the subheadings under yeast health, under which everything else seems to fall, can be categorized at least.
Yeah, I like that from a high level perspective, right? Vitality and viability. I mean, how many yeast are there, and how ready are they to do their job, right? And I mean, it's football season right now, and the Longhorns are in the college football playoffs. So I think of this in the sports analogy. I know you're a Seahawks fan too, Marshall. So right. You'll appreciate this. But like a sports analogy is like, yeah, you can have, at least in college football, 85 players on the team, right? But how many of those are viable? How many of those players are actually able to go out and play football and win for you, right? And then there's vitality. Like, are they injured, right? Is your star quarterback, got an ankle brace on his foot? I mean, that's going to change how the team plays, right? So yeah, that guy is there and he can play for you, and he might still be, the best quarterback that you have on the team, but he's going to be limping around and hobbled, and it's going to hurt you, right? And so that's kind of how I think of those two things. There's viability and vitality, and yet it's exactly like you said, Marshall, that viability is basically just the number of cells that are actually present. And we really only measure that by like an up-down vote. The way that most measurements are done is this methylene blue dye, and living cells can take up the methylene blue dye and convert it into a non-blue color. So they just turn it back clear, right? But dead cells take up that methylene blue and they're dyed and stained blue. So then you count the number of dead cells, and you count the number of total cells, count the number of living cells, dead cells, and then you can have a measure of your vitality, right? Of viability, the number of living cells that are there. But that's just up and down. It doesn't tell you anything about whether those cells are actually ready to make beer or not. This is a really good metric, though, and it's one you can use at home, right? If you get a microscope and some dye, you can count cells. I'm not suggesting that you necessarily need to do that, because as Marshall said, Imperial Yeast and people and a lot of the other companies like like Omega and Escarpment, places where you can get pouches, they're packing, viable and vital yeast. Imperial says that they pack 200 billion cells at the time of packaging, right? So that you have plenty of yeast cells as long as you're pitching fresh yeast. Where this comes into real issue is, if you're not using a starter, the question is how vital, how ready are those yeast ready to go? Because they've just been essentially like hibernating in this yeast pack, right, for a period of time. And how viable are there? How many are there, and how ready are they to go to work? And you have to kind of estimate this, right? If you're not actually counting the living cells, well, two things. Well, you can count viability, but vitality is almost impossible for a home brewer. And in fact, it's difficult for most commercial brewers to know how metabolically active the yeast is. You've got to do a whole bunch of other analyses to figure that out. So most people aren't even looking at that, but you can count the number of yeast cells, and that gives you sort of an idea about the health of the yeast. But from a home brewer, if you don't have a microscope, if you don't have methylene blue dye, or if you're not interested in counting cells, you're kind of just estimating, right? And hoping that, okay, it said it had 200 billion cells at the time of packaging, but yeah, it said on the shelf at my local homebrew shop, or it was in my car as I was driving home for an hour from the homebrew shop. I mean, how many cells are there? And now it's 2 months from the date that it was packaged, because, it took a month for it to get to my homebrew shop and a month for me to buy it before it sat on, even refrigerated in the homebrew shop. Where am I at, and how many cells do I have? It's kind of hard, right, to figure that out. And so that's one of the things that brewers have a struggle with. How many cells am I actually pitching?
No, yeah, that's exactly right. And I it's great that we've got these newer labs that are, and I think even some of the older labs like White Labs and Y Yeast are at least looking for ways to improve viability. I mean, back when I started really focusing on this stuff, 15 plus years ago, it was pretty common to just kind of accept that in a White Labs vial, you really had about 60 billion cells. You compare that to their I forget exactly, Pure Pitch or something like that is what they're calling their new packaging. Mm-hmm. And from what I've heard from people who have actually, scoped these things, the viability is way higher than it used to be. We've got Imperial Yeast, 200 billion cells. And again, from what I hear, it's probably more than that, you've got really viable yeast, but yeast die. And so over time, that viability is going down. And as that yeast, like you said, goes dormant as well, so too does the vitality. Now, because of what you mentioned, vitality is one of those kind of amoebic things for me. It's a difficult thing to really grasp, and you can't measure it on the homebrew scale. It really is something we kind of focus on at the time of pitch. Like, okay, let's just do what we can to make it vital. But we know we can improve viability as well. By doing starters or by pitching more yeast. That is increased viability. So we're going to focus primarily on the viability piece of it because it's easier to talk about. When we talk about viability, one of the terms that is associated with this is just yeast pitch rate. And this just refers to the number of healthy cells, right? Viability that is getting added to a specific volume of wort. So you got viability, which is just the number of living cells in a specific population of yeast. And then yeast pitch rate, which is the number of living cells that you're putting into wort. And there are some kind of standards that we go by. I don't want to belabor this too much. We've talked about it a lot, but for ales, you're looking at around 0.5 to 0.75 million cells per milliliter per degree Plato. Well, whereas for lagers, it's about double that, 1.5 million cells per milliliters per degree Plato. The reason for that with lagers, in part, is because if you're fermenting a lager at traditional temps, it's a lot cooler, meaning increased stress for the yeast. You just really want to give them that opportunity to get in there and do what they need to do. Plus, most lagers, you don't want the ester profiles that you would get from a warmer fermentation temperature. Again, ostensibly, and so. By pitching more yeast, that are, again, viable and vital, at least, you're going to likely produce a much cleaner product with as little risk of off flavors being there. Now, the easiest way to improve your pitch rate or viability is by the use of yeast starters, which you can use a calculator to determine, what size it needs to be based on the style of beer, the strength of that beer, your OG, and then it'll give you kind of a cell count that you should try to, reach with your starter. But another thing that you can do is just pitch more yeast. And the problem with that, and I think the reason a lot of us moved into building yeast starters was because buying more yeast meant spending almost double, right? That is the most expensive ingredient in beer is the yeast. I think Imperial yeast pouches are going for like $12 on average nowadays. So that would be $24 for a 5-gallon batch of beer if you're making like an IPA or something. Well, if you can just buy one pouch and build up a starter for $3, you've saved, almost $10. So that's a big reason. I think it gets even more expensive on the commercial scale. So I think that's a reason a lot of people are going with the starters to improve their yeast pitch rate as opposed to just pitching more yeast.
Yeah, no, I think it's an insurance thing too, right? I mean, we mentioned that you can't measure vitality at the homebrew scale, right? There's just no way to know. But what you can do by making a starter is get the yeast primed and ready to go, right? You put them in. I mean, if anybody's listened to the Brew Lab episode 62 that I had with Maria Mutsoglu, that was the one where we did a low gravity, high nitrogen starter. So instead of starting at your typical like 1040 or 1035 starter for or gravity for a starter, you start at 1008, which is low. That's like 2 degrees Plato, 2 grams per liter of sugar. And what that does is it kicks yeast over into respiration. Yeast normally ferments in the presence of a lot of sugar, and respiration allows them, like us humans, to build up huge amounts of energy by using air and oxygen, right? Fermentation doesn't allow the yeast to build up as much reserve of energy, but it does allow them to go faster, right? So they can go faster for longer during fermentation. So, but what a starter would do is essentially like get the yeast primed and ready to go into the beer. You've put them into a wort solution, whether that's a low gravity or a high gravity, and you've primed them and got them ready to go. That also helps with pitch rate too, right? Because if you have a low pitch, if you don't know what the concentration of cells is in the bag that you pitch, if you do a starter, you build up that concentration, right? So it's probably going to be enough. Now, if you started with a 200, billion cell pack with Imperial and then did a starter from that, you might be really over pitching. And so pitch rate is important, right? Under pitching and over pitching is a piece of this too. Again, the whole goal is to pitch the correct amount of healthy yeast, right? And so that's really the key here. Under pitching and over pitching. I mean, under pitching can have all kinds of problems. You can have sluggish fermentation, stalled fermentation, off flavors because the yeast are super stressed. And then the same thing happens with over pitching too, right? You have weird off flavors because you pitched too much yeast. The yeast, it just doesn't work as well. You can have sluggish issues. The yeast are competing against each other, which means they're not as healthy, potentially. I mean, all of these things. So pitch rate is a function of yeast health, right? So all of this sort of relates together in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. So just a little bit of anecdote here. If you're going to do one or the other, under pitch or over pitch, for the most part, as it relates to beer, at least, add more yeast. We've done a lot of experiments. I get that there's a common kind of theme out there to talk about under pitching being equally as bad as over pitching, or perhaps I should say that oppositely. Over pitching, in my experience, doesn't really cause problems. The biggest thing that I've had with over pitching when I've messed around with it, and I'm like, you really have to do a significant over pitch, is, a beer that kind of has like a bready, yeasty kind of flavor to it, I guess. But really, I mean, I think the issue with over pitching is like, hey, you just don't need to pitch that much. But I get that there are going to be certain, flavor compounds that might be produced when there's that much yeast present. The reality is, though, under pitching is where you're going to get the majority of those undesirable flavor characteristics, or off flavors, as we call them, diacetyl, fusel alcohols, sulfur, esters, because that yeast is stressed. And when it gets stressed, it produces more of these compounds. And so that's really what we want to pay attention to. Now, obviously, there are certain styles that require certain yeast to fit into that style. And in those cases, you might want certain, what we might call an off flavor in a pale ale in a Weiss beer is perfectly acceptable. Same thing with English ale, right? That English ales are tend to have a little bit stronger of an ester profile. With Saison, you're going to get a little bit more of a phenol profile. Belgian ales, you're going to get both of those, and so keeping that in mind will help you to dictate not only your pitch rate, but also things downstream like fermentation temperature and stuff like that. So obviously pitch rate is something that we think is important. And we've done tons of experiments to kind of prove that. Now, the methods, we already talked about this for ensuring a proper pitch rate. You either pitch more yeast, you make a starter to propagate more yeast on your own, or this gets us to the real topic of this show, you pitch fresh yeast direct from the pack from a lab that is giving you enough yeast for that batch of beer. So let's talk a little bit about this whole idea of pitching direct. I know back in about 15 years ago, if you said to your homebrewing buddies that you were just pouring a pack of yeast into your wort, your 5-gallon batch of wort with a single White Labs vial or Y yeast pouch, then you were probably going to get laughed at, because back then you had to make a starter if you wanted to make a good beer.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's all this comment about like how many healthy yeast cells are you actually pitching? And yeah, the White Lab's got a bad reputation for that. Whenever at least whenever I started brewing in the early, let's say early 2010s, you would pitch a batch, and this is, personal anecdote. Like you'd pitch, a package of yeast cells, which they said at the time contained 100 billion yeast cells, which was probably a little bit low for a 5-gallon batch anyway. But I would pitch that, and yeah, I didn't like the outcomes. The beer would take a long time to ferment. It would have some weird off flavors and smells to it. And then I switched over to imperial yeast, and it was like, boom. I was like, oh my gosh, my fermentations are going quickly. And I like the flavors and outcomes better, and I that's not like necessarily a comment on White Labs themselves. I think, that's just the reputation sort of that they developed at the time. And it was my experience as well. But I've often wondered, right? Like, I don't think, I don't know if Imperial is better at growing up yeast than White Labs, or if there's any art to that. Again, not a microbiologist, but I always wondered, is it just because I'm pitching the wrong amount of yeast, right? And so around the time that I switched to Imperial, I also switched over into the Mr. Malty yeast calculators, right? And starter calculators. And like you did, Marshall, going into starters and making sure I was actually, pitching viable and healthy yeast. And I became way more interested in pitch rate and freshness and all of these things, and especially if I had like a pack of yeast that had been sitting in the refrigerator for a while, I'd almost 100% do a starter, right? It's just like, I don't know that I want to trust or that I can risk pitching this and having a bad outcome. So I would always try to do a starter or any of that stuff. I would rarely pitch directly a batch of yeast that was older than like maybe 3 or 4 months, just for fear that it wasn't actually going to make a good beer, that I was going to waste all this time that I'd spent brewing.
Yeah, that is still a common concern. I mean, I get emails from that. I see it on forums still. And I get it. I mean, you consider the fact that you've got, of the 4 primary beer ingredients, right? You've got grain. You can talk about grain staling over time if you want to, but the reality is you can use it. We've done it many, many times. You've got hops. Yeah, they go bad, but it's still not a living organism. You got water. That speaks for itself. There's nothing going on. As long as you mind your chlorine and chloramine, you're going to make a decent tasting beer with it. Yeast is really the only thing that is like an existing thing. It's live, and it does a lot of work for us. So, be mindful of its age, the viability, your vitality, all that stuff. I think it's important. Now, historically, like I mentioned before, you'd get laughed out of the homebrew club meeting if you said that you were pitching a single vial of White Labs, which I want to glom onto your comment. White Labs is a great company. We're not saying that they're bad. We're not trying to pit them against anybody. Right. It's just that they did develop this reputation back in the day. I think they were providing, in my opinion, the best yeast available at the time. It's how I was introduced to San Diego Super Yeast. But they were marketing 100 billion cells, and And we knew we were getting less than that. So it almost felt like we had to make starters after spending, $8 to $10 on a vial of yeast that was kind of under delivering, we'll say. And so that I think that was the reputation. There was some stuff with Diastaticus that kind of sadly contributed to that. Thankfully, they've got all that cleaned up and they're doing a lot better nowadays. So, but modern views, you've got these labs, like you said, Imperial, Giga Yeast, Omega Yeast, who are marketing that they're selling you more than double what these older labs were doing originally. And to me, I was like, well, so does that mean I don't have to make a starter anymore? Well, yeah, if you are pitching it fresh. And that is the key, right? The further away from the manufacturing date we get, the less living cells are present, the less viable that yeast is. And so you've got to be mindful of that. Now, you can question how important really is viability. We've done episodes in the past. We've done so many experiments where we've talked about, viability is important more as an insurance than it is a promise, right? Low viability doesn't necessarily promise that you're going to make a crappy batch of beer, but the risk you run is a lot higher by pitching poor yeast that's low in viability. You want to have that in there to ensure that you're going to get the best results possible. And I think that's the key. It's not a guarantee by any means. Now, I have many experiences where I've gone super, super low. I've underpitched massively just to test this. And in those cases, when I go super low viability, no vitality, basically, the results have always been bad. Just be careful with I have a feeling, Cade, that's a big part of the reason why people who start with these Mr. Beer kits often are one and doners. They brew one. They're like, this home brewing thing sucks. First off, those kits do suck. I'm just going to say I've only made 2 myself. Both times they were awful. And I consider myself a decent brewer with a good grasp of, all of the process. The process isn't even that fun with the Mr. Beer kit. And then the outcome is like, oh, who am I going to give this to, right?
That's an interesting guy. Maybe we should do an experiment. All grain versus Mr. Beer.
We've talked about this many times in the past, right? Cade.
I know. But I haven't brewed a Mr. Beer kit since those first 2 beers that I brewed back then. But yeah, it kind of speaks to like quality of ingredient from back around that time. And it does make me wonder, like, how much of that, carries forward to the present, right? Like, if you have a patch of fresh Imperial yeast and you pitch that into a homebrew size batch, 5 gallons or 20 liters, you're going to be great, right? You're not going to have any, for the most part, at least I don't think I've ever had any vitality or viability issues, right? And I would say, I haven't brewed with White Labs in a long time, but that's probably, if you were to pitch a current version of a White Labs, you'd probably have the same outcome, right? The key here is like consistency, and I am not a consistent brewer, right? I don't have the I would love to be that. But as a home brewer, I'm anything but. I mean, and I'll buy yeast, and oftentimes those yeast sit in my refrigerator for a while. And then it's like, okay, all right, this pack of yeast has been sitting in here for 2 months or 3 months. Can I use it? And again, like my default was always to go back to, I just need to brew a starter, and then that'll work. And the reason why that works is because even if you have one healthy, viable cell in a pack, eventually you can grow that cell up and make beer with it, right? I mean, you could pitch that one cell in a batch of beer and it would probably make beer at some point, right? It'll replicate enough times that if you gave it enough time and ability, it would probably make beer, which is kind of cool to know that, like, okay, that outcome is likely. But it's like you said, it's like risk reward in insurance. Yeah, I don't want to risk my work. I spent 7 or 8 hours of, in the garage brewing this beer, and that was time away from the family. It's time doing other things, right? It's time of whatever. And I want to make this beer. I really am excited about this beer. I don't want to ruin it by getting all the way to fermentation and then pitching an old batch of yeast. It's just like, it's one of those things that's just, for me, has been this is like so ingrained into the way that I brew as a brewer. But then, as I say that, like I see these like 3 or 4 month old batches. I'm like, okay, fine, just make a starter. That'll fix the issue. And I think that is typically what I see most brewers doing whenever they're brewing with old yeast, right? Is trying to make a starter from it and see, because you can see in the starter relatively quickly if that's going to make a yeast or not. It'll either make yeast or it won't, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if it's totally dead, it's just totally going to die. And now that also being said, I've pitched a pack of yeast that was over 6 month old, and I did not get a fermentation. It didn't ferment at all. And I don't know why that was. I don't know if there was contamination or something like that in the package, or if there was something wrong with the way that I brewed, or any of those things. But I remember a package of yeast from a supplier that I won't name that was about 6.5 months old, and I pitched it. Didn't work. Pitched a new batch. I had 2 packs of the same yeast, so I pitched it. Didn't work. Pitched it again. Also didn't work, and then switched to a different type of yeast, and it worked. And I was like, well, I don't know. I don't know if that was a manufacturing issue. They just didn't have enough yeast in it, or if it was a viability issue, or who knows. Maybe I finally just got like a critical mass of yeast cells in the beer, and it worked at that point. But yeah, so to me, this issue of vitality and viability is super important as a home brewer. I mean, it's something that seems to matter, at least anecdotally. And of course, the science backs it up too. You want happy, healthy yeast to make happy, wonderful, good tasting beer.
I love happy beer.
Yeah, right. Don't you? Me too.
So, when it comes to all of this stuff, we do have to, you're going to we talked about it earlier, you're going to take into consideration the style of beer that you're making. And for purposes of this episode, we're going to talk about strong bitter before we head into our break, because that is the style that was used for the experiment we're going to talk about. So if you look at strong bitter is an English ale, which you might expect to have a higher ester profile than your classic American style ale. The BJCP provides the following description of strong bitter: an average strength to moderately strong British bitter ale. The balance may vary between fairly even between malt and hops to somewhat bitter. Drinkability is a critical component of the style, a rather broad style that allows for considerable interpretation by the brewer. I love strong bitter. So when we're thinking about yeast pitch rates with strong bitter, it is recommended to pitch between 0.5 to 0.75 billion cells per milliliter of wort per degree Plato, as we discussed earlier. Now, at this rate, a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of 1050 OG strong bitter would require somewhere between 115 to about 175 billion cells to reach that recommended or proper pitch rate. So what happens if it's lower than that? Because that's really what we're looking at here in comparing a relatively fresh pouch of yeast to an older pouch of yeast. Well, we might expect a higher ester profile, which may or may not be desirable by, the brewer. You might get some other off flavors that you don't like if you're too low. Any other, consequences that you can think of, Cade, of under pitching with old, not fresh yeast, direct from the pouch into a style like strong bitter?
Yeah, I mean, a sluggish fermentation, that it may take longer, or you just might not hit your full attenuation, right? Your yeast just might not perform as well for you. You might be expecting to go from 1050 down to like 1006 or 1008 or something like that, but you might end up at 1012 or 1014 or something if you don't pitch enough healthy, viable yeast. So yeah, those are all concerns, right? Of pitching an older pack of yeast, especially if you're just direct pitching a pack that's been sitting in the refrigerator for a few months, you might not actually complete your fermentation. Your fermentation might be sluggish. It might be slow. There might be off flavors. Any of these things could actually happen.
Yeah, and that's a good point too, is that, oftentimes, especially with the way that we approach, the sensory analysis that we do, it's much more subjective at Brewlosophy. But when it comes to pitch rate, there are also very, objective consequences that you can measure. And the easiest one is attenuation. You know, if you're starting at 1050 and you expect it to get down to 1012 or 1010 FG and it stops at 1018, well, you have an indicator right there that maybe the yeast just wasn't performing properly. Now, I bet most, if not all, people listening to this show have had the experience of brewing a batch and throwing caution to the wind by pitching straight from a yeast pack that's perhaps a little bit long in the tooth. I certainly have, and while the outcome hasn't always been great, as I explained earlier, it usually has worked out, just fine. The beers turned out more or less as expected, but would they have been different, maybe even better, if the yeast was fresher? Well, we performed an experiment looking precisely at this variable, those results, when we return from these messages.
This holiday season, surprise everyone on your list with the best gifts. Tickets to see their favorite artists live. Choose from thousands of concerts and comedy shows, including Mariah Carey, Mary J. Blige, Matt Matthews, Metallica, Thomas Rhett, Trans-Siberian Orchestra, Sarah Silverman, and so many more. Share a memory together or give a gift they'll never forget. Find the most exciting gift for every fan at livenation.com/gifts. That's livenation.com/gifts.
As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts.
Got great ideas, but no idea how to build a website? Get Bluehost. Their AI design tool creates high-quality WordPress sites super fast. Whether you're a blogger, influencer, or launching a side hustle, Bluehost helps boost your growth with built-in marketing and e-commerce tools. Upgrade to cloud and get 100% uptime and 24/7 security to stay online all the time. Why wait? You've got the vision. Make it real. Visit Bluehost.com to get started.
The holidays are here, and Sonos is your go-to for elevating the season. Whether you're hosting a festive gathering or searching for the perfect gift, Sonos has you covered. Fill your home with high-quality sound, fine-tuned by award-winning artists, producers, and sound engineers. Enjoy your favorite holiday music and movies with a cinematic sound experience right from your couch. Plus, Sonos products work together seamlessly, allowing you to create a beautiful sound system. Visit Sonos.com/stand to complete your holiday shopping.
Of the hundreds of batches I've brewed at this point, I'd say the majority have been fermented with yeast that was pitched direct from the package with no starter. And while I try to use the freshest yeast possible, when you've got 8 to 10 pouches sitting in your fridge, well, it's just not always the case, right? You're going to be using yeast that's maybe a little bit older than it should be or than recommended. Well, a few years ago, contributor Jake Houlihan performed an experiment comparing beers where one was fermented with fresh yeast pitched direct from the pouch to one where the yeast was a little bit past its prime.
Yeah, this is an exciting one. I remember whenever Jake was doing this one, I was pretty excited to see the outcome and the results. And so, yeah, he made a single 10-gallon, 38-liter batch of strong bitter. And the malt bill was pretty simple, 95% pale malt and then 5% medium crystal malt. And, since this is a yeast fermentation one, the brewing process was also pretty easy. He mashed it 148 Fahrenheit or 64 Celsius for 64 minutes before collecting the wort and then boiling it for 60 minutes. Now he used, I never know how to pronounce this hop. Is it Pico?
I've heard Pico and Pecco, so I have no idea either.
I have no idea. Anyway, it was a single hop that he used. It's a British hop. It's one of those, it's a newer, I guess, variety of British hops. Have you brewed with Pecco before, Marshall?
I've actually brewed with it, and this was, if people who follow Brewlosophy probably already can tell that this was a Hop Chronicles beer that he made. I'm not actually sure it's from Britain, but it may be a domestic hop that is just has a lot of those British hop characteristics. It could also be British. I don't know. Yes, I've brewed with it. It is very subtle. To me, it's kind of like a blend of, I don't want to put, ideas into people's heads out there. This is my personal experience with it. Kind of a blend between like EKG and Fuggle.
Yeah. So now, this is a Hop Chronicles beer. So this makes a lot of sense then. So he used a half an ounce or 15 grams of pico. Well, let's just use both words. We'll call it pico during this segment. So 15 grams of pico at 60 minutes, and then another half ounce or 15 grams at 30 minutes, and another half ounce, 15 grams at 5 minutes. So again, single hop, strong bitter style beer. After the boil, the wort was quickly chilled and split between identical fermenters with a starting gravity of 1055, which seems pretty reasonable to me.
Yeah, great OG for a strong bitter for sure. That's kind of my go-to. I love, we used to call it ESB back in the day, or extra special bitter, extra strong, whatever. I love it. I love this style. I think this recipe is money. And I know for a while there, Jake was just focused on making the best possible strong bitter he could come up with. So like every experiment he did was surrounding that style of beer, which I thought was pretty cool. So we got this 1055 wort, and this is where the variable comes into play. So both batches received a single pouch of Imperial Yeast A09 Pub. This is the purported to be the fuller strain. I absolutely love this strain. It's probably, as far as ale yeast go, my favorite overall. I love it for American style IPA, mash really low, ferment at 66 to 68. It's just a beautiful yeast. So he used that for these two beers in more of a classic, usage of it as a British strong bitter. The beers were brewed, mind you, in late February of 2019. So the fresh pouch at this point was around a month old. It was packaged in late January of 2019 with a predicted viability of 160 billion cells. That is exactly in line with the recommendation for that 0.75 million cells, per milliliter per degree Plato. So that was money. That's kind of where we got the idea for this experiment. He also had an old pouch of A09 Pub, identical looking, all of that just on a prior order, that was packaged in early November of 2018. So it was about 4 months old at the time of use with a predicted viability of just 82 billion cells, half of that of the fresh pouch, and obviously a clear underpitch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this ends up kind of also being a pitch rate experiment too, right? Like, can you pitch half of the amount of cells and still ferment a beer? But the key thing here too is when we're coming up with those numbers, that's estimates, right? And I believe one thing we probably should have mentioned earlier in the prior segment was how Jake came up with these numbers, right? So the predicted viability here is basically assuming a 20% reduction in cells per month, right? And so it's just taking that 200 billion cells at 1 month old. That means that 40 billion cells have died off, right? So that the 160 billion cells is left. And so these aren't measured cells, but that's kind of the rule of thumb predictor that he did here. And I would think like a 4 month old pouch of yeast might have poor outcomes if you pitched with that. I certainly, if I had that 4 month old pouch, absent, brewlosophy and an experiment, I would have done a starter and probably not direct pitched this pouch.
Yeah, I think a lot of us would have. I might be the only one who'd be like, whatever, toss it in there. But, again, this was 5 years ago, over 5 years ago at this point that he did this experiment. I know for a fact I've been influenced by these fermentation experiments. It may very well be that back then I would have just made a starter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then we got to get to the results of this one to see if that would change our practices. But first we have to go through fermentation. And so the beers were fermented at 66 Fahrenheit, 19 Celsius. And then we talked earlier, Marshall, about objective differences between the beers. And this was the first one that Jake actually observed. So the activity in the fresh yeast batch started within a few hours, while it took the old yeast nearly 6 hours longer before Jake started seeing activity in that batch.
So here's the thing about that. When I first started brewing, 6 hours, if I'm seeing activity even after pitching a starter, I'm pretty happy, right? Yeah. So when he's like reporting this objective data, I think we have to report that relative to what he saw. So it took a few hours, he says, for the fresh pitch beer to show activity, which is awesome. I mean, I think those of us who use Imperial yeast are familiar with that, very well. It took 6 additional hours, to see activity in the other batch. I would still be okay with that. Most of the time I'm pitching and going to bed anyways, so I don't actually know when fermentation activity starts. So to me, I'm like, objectively, it's easy to look and say, see, the fresh pitch is better because the lag was lower. Still, I mean, I'm looking and going, all right, man, that old yeast, what's that say about Imperial? What does that say about, the other parts of the process, I guess? I'd still be okay with that. So at this point, while there is a delta in the time it took, or that lag time, I'm still not as worried as I might have been ahead of time thinking about pitching 4-month-old yeast.
Yeah, totally. And you're not as worried as you might have been when you took hydrometer samples, because that was the next thing that Jake did. And he said with activity absent, so I think that's meaning like from the blow off tube, with activity absent in both batches a week later, he took hydrometer samples from each and noticed a difference in both appearance and in the actual attenuation. And the images of this on the website are like, whoa, like one of them looks like it's done, right? It looks like it's finished beer. The other one looks like the Great Trube experiment, that's like totally full of like just gunk and stuff. And it's really interesting to see that. So the fresh yeast one had nice flocculation. It settled out to the bottom of the hydrometer flask, and it looks like it's finished, right? It looks like done beer. And the gravity of that one was 1008, which I think is where he was targeting, that 1008 gravity. So it was done. The fresh yeast batch was done after a week. The other one, like I said, looked like the Great Trube experiment. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff in there. It looks like it's still in the midst of fermentation, like still actively fermenting, and the gravity on that one was 1013. So yeah, it was actually 5 points higher, which is a full degree Plato higher than the other batch.
Yeah. I'm telling you right now, if you were to serve me or show me serve me, I do drink most of my hydrometer flasks, mind you. But if you were to give me, those two in front of me and say which one is done fermenting, the clear one, right, the fresh yeast batch, would be the one I would pick. The other one was still obviously doing something, even though blow-off tube activity appeared to have had died down in both. Because of this, though, because of that, the disparity between the two of these and their specific gravities at this point, Jake did decide to leave the beers alone for another week just to see if the one pitched with the older yeast would eventually, catch up in terms of attenuation and final gravity. And it did. So again, you're like, okay, you've got this objective observation that not only was there reduced lag, but there was much quicker. I mean, by a week, based on this, who knows when it really finished, but much quicker fermentation and finish to this process that nobody enjoys waiting on, in my opinion, at least. I don't. But it took another week for that older yeast to do its job right. Though I do think it's interesting that both of them ended up finishing at 1008 FG. My hunch is that fresh yeast batch was probably done after 4 days or so of fermenting. So the fact that it took over another week, let's just call it, for that older yeast to do the same exact amount of work is proof enough in itself for me because I'm impatient, right? To do it right, to pitch enough yeast. But in this case, they did finish at the same exact 1008 FG. Fascinating to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I often wonder, too, looking back at this, like how many people would have just called it at 1013? Right? Like if you weren't brewing two back to back and you could see that like, okay, this one actually finished at 1008, maybe I should let this go a little longer. How many people would just say, okay, well, I don't see any fermentation activity. It says 1013. That's a little bit higher than what I was targeting, but fine, whatever. And just keg it from there.
Or keg it or bottle it, and can you say bottle bomb? I mean, I remember talking with Jake about this back when he did this experiment and we published it, and talking exactly about this. How many new brewers, because of their spec sheet says that it should start at 10:55 and finish at 10:12, would pull this and say, 10:13, that's basically done. No, it's the way you brewed it, it's going to get down to 1008. Well, that's going to keep fermenting. If you add sugar to that wort and you throw it in a bottle, not only are you fermenting the priming sugar for your carbonation, that beer is still going to ferment another 5 specific gravity points, you are going to explode bottles. And that is just, with that much sugar left in solution, it's just going to happen if you're adding more sugar to it. So things to keep in mind. Again, like I said, we still haven't gotten into the sensory side of this thing. These are just the objective things that we've seen and we've measured in this experiment. And already I'm going, okay, fascinating stuff.
Yeah, and from a timing perspective here too, right? I would expect maybe some sensory differences here. Again, if you stopped it at that point where it's 1013 versus 1008, the beer might still have acetaldehyde. It might still have some of those fermentation characteristics that haven't been cleaned up yet. And you might still have some diacetyl in your beer. So like all of these things, if you had stopped it there, those beers might have been objectively different. And I don't think I was part of the conversation. I don't think I had started at Brulosophy yet whenever Jake brewed this batch originally. I don't remember. Maybe it was probably right around that time. But I remember a conversation later with Jake where he was saying, I want to redo this one, but I want to stop it there, right? I want to take it at this point and then serve that at the triangle test. And again, for reasons that we discussed, like let's see if it'll actually, when both beers are finished, right? If they actually taste a difference. For example, if this had ended at 1013, if it just hadn't gone down any lower, then we would also say, okay, yeah, there was a sluggish fermentation or there wasn't as much attenuation. Those are objective things. But this is a key point that it did actually finish at the same FG, right? That's a function of the sugar content in the wort. As long as there's a single viable cell in that wort, it'll consume until there's no sugar left to consume, right? Until there's no fermentable sugars left to consume. So regardless of whether you pitched, 100 billion cells or 5 billion cells, those 5 billion cells will consume and continue to replicate and do everything that they need to do to consume until you get to that final FG level. So the attenuation shouldn't change all that much unless there was some other issue with the fermentation itself. Like your yeast weren't vital. They weren't healthy, and so they just weren't able to process all of the sugars, right? They weren't able to do everything that they needed to do. But in this case, it looks like the yeast were actually able to process all of the sugars, which is a cool thing, a kind of a cool takeaway. Yeah, you can pitch with 4-month-old yeast and still hit the same attenuation. It just might take a little longer.
Exactly. It might take a little bit more time. And what could happen because of that, I think, is the key. That's the sensory side. But already, like you said, objectively speaking, I'm looking and going, hey, he got away with using old yeast. And on a numbers level, it took a little bit more time, but everything else seems to add up. And now, they basically caught up with each other. But that is not what we're focused on. Our biggest focus is, can tasters tell a difference in these beers? Was there something about pitching that older yeast that created a perceptibly unique characteristic in that beer compared to the one pitched with fresh yeast? So in this case, first off, I think last objective thing that we want to talk about is the way the beers ended up looking. It's interesting to me that the first samples that he pulled, it was kind of like the hydrometer samples, right? I don't know if you're looking at the photos right now, Cade, but the old yeast beer was hazier than the other one. But it did end up catching up like a week later or something like that. 2 weeks later, I think Jake said. Both of them were crystal clear, beautiful. They looked identical to me. Foam quality seemed to be about the same. Jake did his series of triangle tests, and in his own series, as a completely knowledgeable person about every thing that went into this beer and into this experiment, Jake was unable to consistently identify the odd beer out in several triangle test attempts, and he felt that they were characteristically identical. He thought they smelled, tasted the same, felt the same in his mouth, looked the same, and I think his report back to me was, that was surprising. That's not what I expected based on just how much focus yeast health gets in brewing. That his own personal experience was that it didn't seem to have much of an impact at all.
Yeah. It seems like it was, you underpitched here, right? He underpitched. And that was a result. We saw those objective differences in those gravities that were measured after 7 days of fermentation. So yeah, you would expect I might see some higher esters or fusel alcohols or things that are just going to have a flavor difference. And Jake didn't find that himself, which I'm sure was shocking to Jake, knowing him. And he was probably like, what the crap? I can't believe that that these beers don't taste different. They look different. They had some, fermentation differences. Surely they're different. But again, like you said, Marshall, what we care about is serving it to tasters in triangles. And so in his triangle test, he had 20 participants, which means that we would expect 11 in order to achieve statistical significance, but only 8, that's 40%, could taste the difference in the beers. And so this one was not significant. Tasters could not reliably tell apart a beer that was brewed with 4-month-old yeast from from one that had 1-month-old yeast.
Yeah. And you can already predict what probably half of the listeners are thinking right now, or potentially even screaming at their, speakers, is that people are saying, well, the yeast wasn't old enough.
You got lucky.
Older. He got lucky. All of these things. We felt the same way. Trust me. And I think part of what our approach is what is a reasonable thing that homebrewers are going to do. Maybe we will do a 1-year-old yeast comparison to fresh yeast in basically a repeat of this experiment, and maybe that will produce a significant result. I tend to think it would. But maybe it won't. And in this case, what we were looking at was, how many brewers are out there? We're weird. We have so many ingredients around because we're constantly brewing for experiments, or any of our other projects. So for us to have a pack of yeast around for 4 months usually means we're doing it intentionally to set up an experiment. And that's what Jake did here. Most homebrewers are going to the homebrew shop and buying yeast that is, I guess, expected to be relatively fresh. I'd imagine that any homebrew shop that is selling 4-month-old yeast has probably got it marked down with a sign that says, we recommend building up a yeast starter. Mm-hmm. In this case, that yeast starter likely wouldn't, based on the sensory data, it wouldn't have mattered anyways. It might have made that beer finish faster, as if you'd done a starter, it probably would have finished at the same rate as the fresh yeast beer. But in this case, did that really matter?
Yeah, that's a great point. If you had made a starter or anything, it wouldn't probably have resulted in a different beer. Maybe a faster fermentation again, but not a different beer from a sensory perspective, because you didn't need it in this case. Yeah. Which is, again, I would say, as I read this and as I go through this, I'm screaming like, oh man, Jake got really lucky here, right? But that might be my own bias and my own dogma talking, right? Is like, that something that's 4-month-old, again, it's sort of a knee jerk for me to just go, oh, starter. Okay, it's 4 months old. Okay, starter, right? And not even think about pitching that batch. This was one of those, I wonder if you did this 10 times, how many times it would be bad. Or maybe the quality of yeast is just such that and that style and that recipe is such that even pitching half of the amount of yeast that you needed to pitch, you're still going to get a beer that tastes the same, right? And that's kind of a cool takeaway here, is that as long as you have healthy, viable yeast, even if it's not the correct amount, you can still produce a beer that tastes the same as producing one that has a healthy, correct amount.
Yeah, exactly. So, obviously the implications of this experiment are that yeast freshness just doesn't matter, and you can pitch. Of course, that's not what we're trying to say here. There will be people who hear us in that way, and that is never what we're trying to say.
Right.
I tend to think that part of the reason that experiments like this, including this one, of course, the reason that they return results like this is because we have access these days to just insanely high quality ingredients. And we have companies like Imperial Yeast to thank for that. I think that they, really pushed the envelope. They moved things forward to the point that even some of the more established, long-standing brands out there started to up their quality and their viability and all of that stuff. And so that tends to be where I lean into, is a little bit more just that the reason that this came back the way it did is because just the quality of the yeast in general is better. Do I still pay attention to pitch rates? I do. Not anywhere near as closely as I used to, though. And it's in part because of experiments like this one. They ultimately influenced me to pretty much ditch making starters. I haven't made a starter in years, even when the pouch is a little bit older than what I would like. Now, if I happened to be in a situation where I had a 8-month-old pouch that I really wanted to use, and maybe it got pushed to the back of my fridge or something, yes, I would make a starter. It's not a big deal. But at this point, I'm very rarely coming across yeast that's older than 3 or 4 months old anyways, right? So I feel comfortable personally using that. Do I feel comfortable recommending everybody else do that? Not at all. You do you. If you like making starters and you just like that insurance, then do it. If you don't mind taking a little bit of risk, then go ahead and do it the way that we do it. It's up to you. We're not making any recommendations, but I do think it's just really, really cool. Another data point to kind of add on this path of understanding yeast viability and yeast pitch rate.
Yeah, totally. I mean, again, take these conclusions with what you will. I mean, like I said, if you had repeated this experiment 10 times, would you have the same outcome, right? I mean, who knows? Maybe not. Maybe 4 or 6 of those would be wrong. I mean, or, would show a difference here. Who knows? But again, I do think this gives you some confidence, right? Especially as a home brewer, this gives you some confidence like, oh man, crap. I got my wort ready, but I forgot to get yeast. Or whatever, or oh man, this has been sitting in my refrigerator for 4 months. I didn't make a starter. I'm just going to go ahead and pitch it. Should give you some confidence that like, okay, yeah, maybe this will work, right? And It's not the end of the world if it doesn't, right? There are other things you can do at the end before you have to dump the batch. You can add more yeast if you need to pitch, if you need add some newer, fresher yeast if you're not getting a fermentation. You can let it sit a little bit longer, it sounds like, to make sure it's finished out all the way. Yeah. Lots of things that you can do if you pitch with an older yeast pack.
Yeah, without a doubt. Now, we did get some reader comments. We're just going to focus on a couple here. The first one comes from Frank Z, who says, with Imperial Yeast A04 Pub at the end of its shelf life, 5 to 6 months old, I had significant ester production, which was perceived as an off flavor by a professional brewer. Despite making a starter, it was still an underpitch. Okay, Cade, you probably already know where I'm going to go with my response to this comment, but that's why I'm going to let you respond first.
Yeah, I mean, A04 Pub is one of those yeasts that's supposed to have esters, right? It produces esters. And yeah, I mean, one that's at the end of its shelf life, 5 to 6 months, sure. Maybe it's going to produce more esters because of the underpitch. But 5 to 6 months is 1 month later than Jake pitched. Would we really see that big of a difference between the one that was pitched at 5 or 6 months versus the one that was here? I don't really know. And again, in a strong bitter, the esters are desirable. So I'm glad, again, I think one of the takeaways from this experiment is that you can underpitch and still make the same quality beer. That's not necessarily that you should underpitch or that anything that Jake did here is recommended, but it's that you can do it and have a beer that tastes the same.
Yeah, the way I like to say it is that it's not a guarantee that you're going to make a crappy batch of beer if you underpitch. Are you running higher risk? Absolutely. I don't think there's anybody who would disagree with that. Here's my thing with Frank Z's comment is, first off, this is a classic appeal to authority. A professional brewer tells him that there's esters in the beer, and so he buys that there's esters in this beer that shouldn't be there. And then when you think that, you automatically go to, well, I did use 5 to 6 month old yeast, even though I made a starter, which, by the way, even a tiny starter with 5 to 6 month old yeast is likely going to get you into the proper pitch rate range for this style of beer. Or he actually didn't say what the OG of his beer was, but I'm assuming, he's using A04 Pub, that it was probably a moderate strength British beer. I could be wrong on that. So first off, that's my big thing is, and I get it. We've all done it. Somebody who's well known, maybe it's even us. We say something and then you use that with your homebrew friends, to say that this is truth. And that is not what we're saying. We make it a point constantly to point that out. So I'm not so sure, I would take the word of somebody just because they have a job brewing beer at a brewery. We've all been to breweries where they shouldn't have that job. The other thing is you're not comparing it to anything. So how do you know it had any more esters than one, like we did in this experiment, that was pitched with fresher yeast that was a standard pitch rate, not an underpitch? You don't know, and I think that's what inspired the whole experiment series in the first place. Is I was making all these claims, even if it was just to myself, about the beers that I was making, and fully convinced I knew why they tasted this way or where this perceived issue came from. But I wanted to compare them. I was comfortable being wrong, right? And I wanted to compare these beers. And that was the only real way that I found that I could determine, okay, is it really this specific variable? Is it pitch rate? Is it the freshness of the yeast? So Frank, it sucks that you made a beer that it sounds like you ended up maybe not liking too much. But if that's the case, I would at least stop short of fully convincing yourself that that was the issue. It could have been, we know that wild yeast create esters as well. It could have been a contamination. It could have been water profile. It could have been the grains that you use, the hops that you use. There's so many
storage, shelf stability, any of these things.
All that stuff. Exactly. So, again, not to diss you, Frank, we appreciate you leaving the comment. I just think that we all have friends like this who are, experienced brewers, whether they're professional brewers or home brewers who they think quite highly of their opinion. And that's okay. You get that in any hobby. I caution people against fully buying into, the claims that these folks make. So final comment we got from a guy named Ben. He says, interesting stuff. You could interpret this experiment as another pitch rate test, backing up previous results showing that pitch rate appears not to affect flavor in a significant way. That makes sense to me, provided there's enough oxygen. Yeast will always multiply and make up the numbers, whether in a starter or in the main wort. The only downside is a slightly longer schedule. What say you, Cade?
This is kind of also the flip side of that comment, right? It's kind of like Frank Z had convinced himself that yeast is going to produce esters anytime, or significant off flavor esters anytime you under pitch it. And unfortunately, it seems like Ben is saying the same thing, but the opposite way, right? That pitch rates don't matter, right? That as long as there's oxygen, pitch rate doesn't matter. And this is, again, one of those places we talked about it all the time on the Brew Lab, is that the science would suggest different, right? There's been a whole bunch of research out there that has shown that if you underpitch your beer, that results in higher fuse alcohol, higher esters, and all that kind of stuff, right? But that doesn't mean that every single batch is going to have the exact outcome, right? More often than not, if you underpitch, these are the results that you're going to experience, right? But it doesn't mean that you can just throw it out the window and go, I'm just going to underpitch everything and not give a crap. I'm going to brew with 8-month-old yeast all the time and never really care. No, I don't think you can go that far, right? But again, I will say what this showed is that under these conditions that were brewed in this triangle test, in this Brewlosophy experiment, there was no difference. And they were totally able to use older yeast that was arguably pitched, and an underpitch of what would have been recommended. And he made a beer that tastes just the same as a beer that we did using normal conditions. So again, a takeaway for me here is not disregard pitch rate, and it's also not underpitching is always going to result in esters, right? The takeaway here is here's one example where pitching with an older yeast pouch didn't result in a bad beer, right? And so that should give you some confidence, or at least a little bit more willingness if you have an old yeast pouch to brew a beer with it. But again, don't take it as gospel.
Yeah. No, yeah. So whereas Frank Z's comment was classic appeal to authority, I feel like Ben's comment is a good illustration of classic confirmation bias. We look at the data to confirm what we want to confirm, basically. And that seems to be the case here. Again, we're all guilty of it. Totally guilty of it all the time. You don't realize you're doing it. Bias is bias. It's totally normal. Don't feel bad about it. No one's making fun of you. Everybody is victim to it. In fact, I was just talking with a psychologist friend of mine last week about just how the comment that I made was, we were talking about who to trust, basically, when it comes to treatment and all that stuff. And I repeated a kind of a trope that somebody I look up to back when I was in grad school. What he said to me was that if ever you meet a therapist who claims to be unbiased, they're probably the most biased person there is. They have a high degree of bias, in part because the recognition of your bias is what allows us to be more cognizant of that bias and to see how it's impacting things. And so the reason I bring this up so often, one, I'm fascinated by it. It's what motivated me to become a psychologist. But also I think it plays a role in the decisions that we make making brewing as well. And if you're convinced, for example, that pitch rate doesn't affect the flavor in any significant way at all, you're going to find yourself at some point pitching very, very old yeast with low viability, super low pitch rate, and you're not going to like that outcome. I have done that. I'm telling you right now, I have done it multiple times. I've told the story about the Kolsch that I made, the very first brew in a bag batch, 10 or so years ago, and it smelled like burnt tires and fart. I'm just saying, it was awful. So that is not the case that pitch rate doesn't matter. I think the window, or what the evidence that we've gleaned from these experiments, the way that I like to look at it is it shows that the window, that range, that pitch rate range may not be as hard and fast as a lot of us were kind of led to believe, that there is a bigger window that you can be a little bit of, outside of the recommendation and still get away with a really good batch of beer. And to me, that's good enough. We are not saying by any means that pitch rate doesn't matter or that yeast freshness doesn't matter. And with that is all the time that we've got for this episode. Do you have any final words, Cade?
Yeah, I had just one more thing since we're wrapping up. One thing that I saw some other comments about this that when they were talking about this, and it was a comment that if you use, we've always heard that if you do multiple generations of yeast, like if you do like Gen 1, Gen 2, like harvesting yeast, that the fermentation goes faster, right? And so like propagating yeast makes the fermentation more efficient. That's not necessarily a viability versus vitality thing here, right? So that's just like you've made new yeast, right? Like you've made new yeast and you've got 100%, you've got 200 billion viable cells that you're pitching, right? So I think it's important to remember here as we circle back, like a viability, vitality are the important things to consider here, right? Are you pitching the proper amount of healthy yeast? So keep that in mind as you're going through this. What Jake showed here is that, maybe you can get away with it, but still, best practices, best insurance, pitch the proper amount of healthy yeast.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, and great points there, Cade. Now, just a quick heads up, we are going to be taking a break next week as I'm going to be heading out of town for New Year's with the family, and then the first week of January is when we're going to do our kind of annual review of the last year. But I just wanted to give our listeners, wish them all the happiest of holidays. I don't mean to get too sentimental or anything. I just want to make you all know make sure that you all know how much we appreciate your support, whether that's through Patreon, using our affiliate links, or even just listening, reading, and watching the content we create. We love doing this, and we've been able to continue doing it because of you. So again, thank you so much, Cade. I love you, dude. And I like to think that a part of your legacy is the Brew Lab, as bummed as so many of us are to see it go. I am beyond stoked for your future in brewing and beer as a real scientist, of course, as well as for the fact that you're now going to have more time to be with your family, as well as kick it with me on this podcast like we did today.
Yeah, I love it. I look forward to being a more regular guest on the Brewlosophy podcast now. But yeah, check out the last episode of the Brew Lab, which will drop on Christmas. So the final Christmas present from Brewlosophy and from the Brew Lab. It's going to be a great one. We've got Vinny Chilurzo, John Bryce, and Jordan Folks on there talking about science. You're going to love it.
Absolutely excellent episode that you all need to go listen to. Now, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Brewlosophy Show, where Brewlosophy's Martin Keene is doing all sorts of fun stuff with brewing and beer, from our standard stuff like experiments and short and shoddy to weirder projects like brewing beer in a bathtub. We've got a bunch of neat new ideas coming up for the new year as well. It can all be found over at youtube.com/@the-Brewlosophy-show or by searching YouTube for Brewlosophy. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more. Life is good, the likelihood of me.
This holiday season, surprise everyone on your list with the best gifts. Tickets to see their favorite artists live. Choose from thousands of concerts and comedy shows, including Mariah Carey, Mary J. Blige, Matt Matthews, Metallica, Thomas Rhett, Trans-Siberian Orchestra, Sarah Silverman, and so many more. Share a memory together or give a gift they'll never forget. Find the most exciting gift for every fan at livenation.com/gifts. That's livenation.com/gifts.